And I'm also founding director of the ETSU Ballad Health Strong Brain Institute. The majority of Americans have experienced at least one major adverse experience at some point in their childhood. 1 in 4 of our students have lived through or may still be living through 3 or more major adverse experiences. The goal of the Strong Brain Institute is to use the science of childhood adversity coupled with mitigation science and resilience science to prevent and mitigate the negative impacts of ACEs on children's and adults' lives, and to promote awareness in the use of resilience-informed procedures and policies, both at ETSU and throughout the Appalachian Highlands region. We are a resource for people to turn to when they have questions about how best to employ resilience-informed strategies and practices in their workspaces. I'm really happy that you could join us today for our Resilient Speaker Series, and I'm going to hand over the virtual mic to Becky Haas, who's one of our own trauma-informed and resilient superstars, for the introduction.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon, and welcome everyone who's joining today. So I am a founding member of Strong Brain Institute, and it's really a delight today to introduce colleagues in national work, Jesse Kohler and Whitney Marris. So by way of a quick introduction, we've served together on the National Trauma Campaign together, and I know they're going to really provide some great information and inspiration. So Jesse currently serves in the role of the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice on loan from the ANS Research, where he works there on policy and system change initiatives. Above all else, Jesse has always had a strong vision for change that would make our world a sustainable and better place for all. Born and raised outside of Philadelphia, after graduating from Oberlin College, Jesse spent the first part of his career working for various nonprofits, serving Philadelphia communities, and working at the state level for both the Office of Attorney General and the Governor's Campaign. He started with CTIP as its first intern a year after it was incorporated, later becoming a board member that year, and then serving as the executive director when support for the position became available in 2021. So I'm going to quickly introduce Whitney and then let the two of them continue. So Whitney Marris is CTIP's Director of Trauma-Informed Practice and System Transformation. In this role, Whitney supports the CTIP team in integrating and operationalizing the guiding principles of a trauma-informed approach in its all aspects of work. In addition to this role, Whitney also works as organizational trainer and coach who supports organizations, communities, and systems of care in becoming more trauma-informed, a trauma therapist in private practice in the DC metro area, and adjunct instructor with the University of Buffalo social work. Outside of time spent working, you can usually find Whitney learning something new or spending time with her partner, Alex, and their miniature schnoodle, Jennifer. So welcome, Jesse and Ben, to the Strong Brain Resilient Speaker Series.
Thank you so much, Becky. What an intro. Appreciate it. Yes, my schnoodle, Jennifer. You were like, what is that word? Miniature schnauzer toy poodle for anybody who is keeping score. I'm just going to go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint here. So glad to be with you all today. Just really looking forward to the time we have together. And we do have a period reserved for question and answer, hoping we can have some time for connection as well. And just to let you know what to expect during our time together, we are going to start with sort of an overview of CTIP 101, we'll say, right? Like just a little bit of an overview of the history and who we are, what we do, our vision for a preferred future that we are looking to expand into with your help as advocates. Building power and momentum toward change. So again, how you can, gather people together, convene people and mobilize them toward advocacy, whatever you are targeting in your advocacy campaigns. Federal, state, and community context. So what that means is basically we're going to take a look at what advocacy can look like at all different levels, right? You don't need to start from super big. You can start from local politics. You can do state politics and federal. And we're going to take a good look at sort of the differences between those venues. The significance of a living system thinking frame. So Jesse's going to talk to you a little bit about that social ecological theory that is embedded in the work that we do and that we believe is critical to enacting the change that we want to see in the world. Identifying and advancing trauma-informed policy. So sort of a quick primer on what actually makes a piece of legislation trauma-informed, right? What do we look for? What would we advocate for? And what language might we look for and use to identify those pieces of legislation? Storytelling for advocacy. So there's a specific framework we're going to share with you. We really like this in terms of being able to tell your advocacy story in ways that shape behavior, toward change in a macro sense. And CTIP resources available to you and ways to get involved. So a little plug for us at the end of that if you feel like you like what you hear and you want to learn more or do more with that. And then finally, again, that connection opportunity. That's our best hope, is that we have some time for some Q's, some A's, and some connection. And I think that is pretty much it in terms of what you can expect. So we've got a pretty full hour. And Jesse, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to you to get us started with that very first item, that CTIP 101.
Thanks, Whitney. So, in always wanting to model the model, we like to start with PADs, predictions, acknowledgements, and disclaimers about beyond the roadmap that Whitney just laid out, sort of some things that you may come across and feel and think as you listen to our presentation. So, we recognize that there's hesitancy as well as excitement for different people to engage in advocacy work. And those feelings are real on both sides of that equation. Many, if not everybody on this call, is engaged in trauma-informed work at some level, and so we recognize and appreciate and honor your expertise on this call and are really excited for that connection point for that reason, to hear about your experiences and some questions that you have. Some of you may have heard of CTIP, others may not have. Either way, we love being here with all of you. And after our hour together, there's very likely going to be more information that folks want and looking forward to ways to get involved. We certainly think that this work is incredibly exciting, and we welcome everybody as we continue to build this movement to prevent trauma and foster resilience. To note, we'll share resources and opportunities to dive deeper, and certainly hope you'll stay in touch with us as we move forward. And so on the next slide, we just want to recognize that we are standing on the shoulders of giants with this movement. And in CTIP. CTIP was founded in 2015 by many of the foremost experts and leaders of the trauma-informed movement. Sandy Bloom is our board chair, and Dan Press was our longtime pro bono general counsel. And their spirit, their energy is embedded within the organization, as well as that of so many others. And CTIP was founded by Sandy, Dan, and a few others like Andy Blanche, Susan Salison, and others who sort of recognized that there were two gaps, that there needed to be a national organization to fill. Sorry, our Alexa was decided to become activated in the condo. So the two gaps were that there was a missing federal advocacy voice in the trauma-informed movement. When you went to the Hill, people didn't understand what ACEs were, and trauma was really resigned to the experiences of veterans or an experience like a car accident, but those deeper insidious wounds that drive negative social outcomes and behavioral outcomes and physical health outcomes. There wasn't that sort of understanding. And then the other piece was that within the trauma-informed movement at the time, so much of the work was siloed. Trauma-informed education, healthcare, legal system, so on and so on. But there wasn't a vision, or there was a missing vision for what an integrated society looks like when those sectors come together and create that comprehensive vision for how a fully trauma-informed society can truly work together. And so that was where CTIP sort of planted its roots and where we've grown from. For the first 6 years of our organization, we were completely volunteer driven. Myself, Whitney, Becky, all of our board members, and so many other advocates and advisors all volunteered their time because there is such passion behind the movement and such a knowledge that this is necessary. But after the pandemic, this work has been necessary for so long. But we started to receive funding and have started to build a small team and are sort of in that startup nonprofit mode now. And through that, we've developed several initiatives that coordinate and advance the community-led, trauma-informed, prevention-oriented, resilience-focused, and healing-centered movement. And there is a link at the bottom of that page where you can look at many of our past accomplishments. And there are also several resources in our resource center about the history of CTIP. Our work is embedded in what we call neurosciences, and many of you have likely heard this term before. Neuroscience is neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience. It provides a more holistic view of the strengths as well as the brain science and the historical and intergenerational traumas and what we know about developmental adversity and trauma that creates that whole view of how we are promoting this work. And so we have a nice hashtag that is Hope is Near, which we hope y'all will start to join us in promoting on social media. That's healthy outcomes from positive experiences is neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience. That's what Hope is Near stands for. And as we look at what CTIP actually does, what our approach looks like, we define it in 4 key areas: advocacy, education, networking, and research to coordinate and promote the trauma-informed movement. And what that really looks like is building relationships on the Hill as well as with advocates and community coalitions that are driving this work. Again, the first word that we use when we define like the whole movement of community-led, trauma-informed, prevention-oriented, resilience-focused, and healing-centered is that community-led piece. We need to get that input and feedback and understand how this work is being implemented in communities, because we know that healing happens in the context of healthy relationships over time, and that is happening through the grassroots. But in our relationships with policymakers, we're also able to drive those relationships to help drive change at the policy level. And we'll get into in a bit, and you'll probably hear us say over and over again that policy creates conditions for communities to potentially thrive. It can also create conditions that do very much the opposite. And so that's where our advocacy is very important. Part of building relationships is obviously fostering dialogue, creating conversations, learning about what's going on, and having that networking piece, making sure that we are connected as a movement and learning from each other and fostering dialogue across all levels. And through our relationships and what we learn through our conversations, we seek strategic opportunities to drive the work forward. The trauma-informed movement is nonpartisan, and so we continue to work to find strategic policy opportunities that, regardless of who is in power, we are able to continue to push the trauma-informed movement forward, as well as seek strategic opportunities to leverage resources and supports for community to continue to promote this healing-centered work at the grassroots level. And the last part is that we recognize that in trauma-informed work, we are also driving racial and social justice, that those two operate so closely together. And that is part of everything that we just discussed, of the relationships that we build, the dialogue that we have. And we continue to drive that closer and closer, to have that healing-centered lens as we continue to work to address marginalized and oppressed systems and frameworks that have been in our country and in our world for so long. And so with that, I will turn it over to Whitney to get more into the content of the lesson today.
Thanks, Jesse. I feel like you encapsulated that really, really beautifully, and it's such a great segue. I just really appreciate you lifting up some of those key accomplishments and the historical context and what policy really does in terms of what we think of it as in our roles. And so I'm going to hone in, as Jesse mentioned, a bit on another really significant lesson that we've learned through all of that history that Jesse just walked you through. And that's really centered on where a lot of the power is distributed in advocacy work at all levels. And so on this slide, before we dig into some of those different avenues for advocacy that we talked about earlier, you see a few qualities, characteristics, and contexts that we have found are particularly significant, I would say, in contributing to the efficacy of our particular advocacy goals. So, there are many, many, many broad issues out there, right, that stakeholders and key actors in both formulating and implementing policies are paying attention to. And so this is about, what is it that really helps your policy agenda get the elevated importance that it needs to build that momentum toward the change that you want to see happen. And so because we know that, frankly, some of the steps that we're proposing to be taken are sometimes kind of revolutionary, right? Like we are in a sea of competing issues. And given what we know about how systems like to maintain homeostasis, right? So they like to cling to that comfortable status quo that they're used to. So whether or not it's effective, by the way, right? Normalcy can become maybe dysfunctional, but it's still normalcy. That feels safe, that feels predictable, and it keeps power dynamics the way that they are. And let's face it, there are a lot of folks in power, right, who don't want to give it up. And that makes a lot of sense. And so those people who have a groups who have a vested interest in keeping things the same might not like our change proposal so much. So we're up against a lot of potential competing demands, and these dynamics are at play all the while. And so with the change proposals that we make that are asking folks to really step outside of that status quo, go into a completely different space to see a different way to move forward, our way to move forward, that can be pretty revolutionary. And you have to build power to be able to compete with all of these demands and interests. And of course, there's going to be ambivalence around that for the reasons we talked about, right? This is a paradigm shift we're talking about. This is transformational change that we're proposing. And so as you see on this slide, when we think about what we've seen be particularly helpful at CTIP in moving policy agendas along, we start with the power and capacity held either formally or informally, again, to really influence either groups or individuals who are needed at the table to support and create this change. Money, votes, those things matter. And so the people who have a lot of power in those realms are going to have a lot of influence naturally. And you can see on the slide, of course, that things like the dominant discourse and trends, the prevalence of relevant knowledge being available, and a lot of other factors are influential in determining which advocacy agendas are really actually taken up and which ones sort of fizzle out. And importantly, at the very bottom, as we've worked at growing our movement at CTIP, we have really recognized that even up against all of the characteristics and qualities listed here, there is tremendous power in bringing people together. We really believe that. That's what our model is predicated on. And so it's predominantly about uniting different groups that are working together towards similar solutions and combining those efforts to achieve even more powerful results. You know, there's strength and there's power in numbers. And we have a whole advocacy series on CTIP's website that gives some more specificity around how to grow advocate networks. So if this is jazzing you, you're like, oh, I want to learn a little bit more about that, want to go a little further into the weeds, on things like maybe how to build your advocacy agenda, things like forming your network, those sorts of topics. Those are in our advocacy series that we'll link to later. So let's talk about some of the key ways while we're together that we found success in growing and mobilizing our advocate networks at sort of a very high level. And so on this slide are some practical strategies for engagement that we found to be significant in helping to join and mobilize and maximize the advocacy impact of individuals and organizations and groups, all of which has really helped us as an organization increase our power to advance change that is aligned with our mission, vision, and values at CTIP. And I think the greatest takeaway, if I were to sort of summarize this slide, is really that first point, right? People want to be a part of things that they care about. They want to participate in ways that are aligned with their interests, their strengths, their skills, and which fit for their busy lives. And so one of the greatest barriers to entry and also sustained engagement in advocacy is a lack of clarity or guidance. And so giving folks a variety of tools and pathways that makes advocacy both impactful and easy is something that has really helped us at CTIP tremendously over time. And so that means setting folks up for success and recognizing too, from your framework, this might be what you wake up thinking about, right? This is your job, this is your passion. And yet that might not be true for everyone. And yet every single level of participation is meaningful in advancing your advocacy agenda. And that's from, again, the paid employee whose job it is to represent constituent voices in direct meetings with their political and administrative figures, to the volunteer who has an interest, doesn't necessarily come to meetings, but retweets the blog post your organization or group wrote, all of that matters. All of that has value. And so creating tools and avenues for folks, from pre-written social media messages to talking points to holding meetings to have discussions and guidance, the options are really limitless in terms of the way you could make advocacy simpler and more straightforward for folks who have these varying levels of investment and interest in your agenda. And we believe that that's something that can really help you build that power and momentum toward change. And in addition, sharing data that really honors the perspectives of those who are most impacted by the issues at hand to really help people hone in on what's most important can really focus and strengthen your advocacy efforts. So that means, knowing key players to bring on board, making sure that you are getting the voices of lived experience and you are uplifting those in addition to maybe the more academic frames you might take. Thinking about who could be champions in the community based on what you know about their interests or their strengths and skills and their unique gifts that they bring to the table. All of that can be huge to pay attention to. And lastly, in terms of this slide, I think one of the things that we also really try to center on is sharing successes and really demonstrating gratitude, again, for all levels of participation that people give, including celebrating wins that are big and small. That really draws in new people and also helps keep advocates who are already supporting the work invested and engaged because they can see the meaning and impacts of their work, right? So that's really critical in systems change because this work takes a long time. You're not going to see things change overnight. And so really illuminating those events that are celebratory can be really important. And again, in our more detailed advocacy series that we'll lift up details about later, we go again more into the weeds of sort of how and when to provide messaging, things like that are all included. So if you're interested again in more granular stuff, that's there for you too. But just in terms of this high level, we're hopeful this gets your brain thinking, about like, what is it that makes sense for me? What fits for me in terms of growing my own network to achieve the change that I want to see? And so in terms of just thinking about what this might look like for you at this really high level, again, we want to emphasize that there are many, many, many different venues for advocacy that we've seen meaningful action on. And, if you're looking to get started, as I said earlier, you do not have to start like Jesse did, where he jumped into being the CEO of a national organization right out of the gate, right? Like you can probably start smaller and that's okay too. Everybody will be wanting to begin based on a lot of different factors. And so we just have on this slide different types of places you can focus your efforts at each of these levels in a variety of different settings, and who might be useful to target depending on what you hope to get done and what makes sense for you venue-wise. And ultimately, you really want to think when you're looking at this table really deeply about who actually sets a policy or administers a program to get a better idea of what avenues you have and what procedures you may need to consider in your advocacy strategies. So, for example, say you notice that the free health clinic down the street that provides maybe the majority of health services and support to the folks in your community has some eligibility criteria that's set at, let's just say like 150% of the poverty level, just for kicks, because we're having a hypothetical here. But that level is just too strict right now. Lots of people have fallen on economic hardship in response to, COVID-19 and other circumstances that have impacted our society in a collective way. Because it's an area where maybe mostly service jobs are the main professional affiliation, and or maybe you rely on tourism each year to support the job market. Lots of different reasons that might happen where that 150% threshold isn't meeting local needs based on where the here and now. And more people then are seeking support to meet their basic needs, yet on paper, they may have too many assets to qualify for the help that they need. So you'd want to know, in that example, for instance, did the board of the agency set that policy? Or is the clinic, for example, a part of similar community clinics that are all statewide, that all receive funding through legislation that the governor signed into law, and that law outlines the eligibility requirements for all places in the state, in which case you might be looking at the state row there for your advocacy effort. Or maybe there are federal funds that the agency receives from the federal government. And the federal government is the entity that determines eligibility criteria for recipients. And therefore, maybe your advocacy strategy in that case involves reaching out to, let's say, your congressperson or your state senator to demonstrate that constituents want change at the federal level in this area. And so all of these advocacy strategies may look different for the same issue, contingent upon a lot of individualized details and the constellations of needs in your community. And so what's effective in one venue or context is going to look really different than what might be useful in another. And again, covered in depth in the series for those of you who want to learn about the lot of ways that you can make a difference going through both government and non-government actors, as are highlighted here. That's available for you. Just before moving on, there is one thing that we really want to invite consideration around, and that's that in terms of the levels of policymaking, local government controls many aspects that we might take for granted, right? And those initiatives we notice often get missed as opportunities for advocacy, as such a powerful venue for affecting change that targets local conditions like Jesse was talking about, that can create context for people to thrive much more effectively than sort of a sweeping federal piece of legislation. And that, access to green spaces, sidewalks, roads, all of that, and public safety considerations, how police are run, many aspects of school operations. There are a lot of really important day-to-day affecting things that are under local government purview. So we really like to lift that up when we're together. And, that's an advocacy avenue where knowing your community and being embedded in your community in the ways that I would imagine many of you on this call are, can be a real asset to building further community capacity to support and implement more trauma-informed practices and policies. And so, because it is such a powerful and often more accessible avenue to advocate in, and some of this isn't just about policy work, right? Some of the work to be done in advancing trauma and resilience and near-informed policies and practices is, again, to create that context and the conditions to support the actual implementation of these changes. We really want to illuminate the community aspect of things. So, even if you're not necessarily a policy wonk like some of us on this call, building community capacity for change is something anybody can do. And it's one of the most impactful ways to contribute to these broader advocacy efforts. And so on this slide are some thoughts about, what we've learned helps create that context and conditions for the type of localized empowerment that we've learned is often really needed to support sustainable change on the ground and in communities. And so, depending on the community, that work might entail consciousness raising about the nature and impacts of trauma and adversity, or promoting healthy, pro-social, and culturally grounded individual and collective coping that's responsive to really those day-to-day realities of your individual unique community. Might be things like organizing town hall meetings as a venue for folks to come together and brainstorm. Really, there are so many avenues for this. And again, we emphasize the importance of engaging local wisdom in ways that honors the unique ways of knowing, being, and doing that characterize your community. And that the people who live, work, and play and connect within that community embody. And they are considered the experts, right? Community members are the experts rather than, coming in as, and I'm a member of an academic institution, the Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care out of Buffalo, New York. And one of the important things is to recognize, we are the academics in this. We might be facilitating some of these changes, but we are not the experts simply because of our titles. In fact, we are, because of our titles and our outsider sort of status, we are not the people who ought to be making the choices. We provide support, technical assistance, and that's the consideration for any advocacy effort toward change. Professionalized entities sometimes do to or for in a very well-intentioned but paternalistic way, rather than with community members. So really just emphasizing the power of honoring lived experience and trusting that the people who are most impacted are going to know what they need to change. They're going to know what they want to see happen with greater clarity than we ever could if we're coming in as outsiders or, mobilizers or organizers, whatever we might be. That can be a really valuable role. Honoring that expertise of the community is always number one. At least for CTIP, that's something we always really strive to do. And so Jesse, I'm going to pass it to you. And before I move on to the slide, in case there's anything you want to add here, I know you also have some great information for us that sort of ties together the framing for this, that highlights the interconnectedness of it all. But before we move on, just want to give you the floor in case you want to add anything.
Yeah, thanks, Whitney. We can move on, but I'll say that, sometimes you'll hear us talk about democracy as the antidote to trauma. And really, what we're talking about there, again, is not a partisan comment, but it's talking about how getting input from every part of a living system helps us to better organize and coordinate that system to continue to improve on an ever-growing process and the evolution of our systems moving forward. So frequently our systems become static, and that becomes problematic because we need to always be growing. To me, trauma informed is not a destination. It is a commitment to a process of continuing to improve our practices and policies, and that requires people's input so that way we can we can learn about how people are experiencing the systems at all levels. And so that's what we mean by democratic, that small d democratic, that continual process. And so as the democracy, as the antidote to trauma, another framework that we want to bring in, and for our public health professionals and friends on this call, this is probably a term that you've known for a long time, but folks like me just learned about it recently. And that's a syndemic, which has actually become a little bit more of a palatable word in our country's vernacular because of the pandemic, because of the root of that word. But a syndemic is a set of linked health problems involving two or more afflictions interacting synergistically and contributing to excess burden of disease or hardship throughout a population. And so when we look at trauma as the root cause of so many behavioral, social, and physical health challenges that our country is currently grappling with, we see the need for trauma-informed approaches. We see the need to address the root cause of all of these problems as trauma, which historically our systems have not been great at. We try to solve these in silos, and that goes back to the first part of what CTIP was sort of created to help to address, is that if we address the root cause, what we've seen across various models, one of the most famous ones being the self-healing communities model in Washington State, is that by addressing trauma at the root cause, by creating living and learning systems, we reduce the prevalence of several problematic indicators throughout our society and improve lives perpetually and exponentially in the future, as we also reduce the transmission of intergenerational trauma. And so syndemics occur when health-related problems cluster by person, place, or time, which gets back to what Whitney was talking about how each community, the work needs to look different based on the population's needs, resources, and desires that we see. But addressing that root cause and bringing folks together to do so is such an important aspect of how we are going to address trauma at the root cause. And as Whitney hinted at a few slides ago, we're going to talk about the social ecological model. And we also recognize that in our society, onus is so often put on the individual for their own healing, when we need to recognize that that is insufficient. There is individual capacities and strengths that can be built, but if our systems are promoting stress and adversity onto individuals, families, and communities, then we will continue to drive predictable outcomes at those levels. And so we really need to look at how our systems are impacting the health and well-being of individuals, and not just place that onus on any one person, any one family, any one community, and work systemically to improve outcomes as a whole. And we recognize, again, that policy creates conditions for communities. One strong policy example that we are working to promote is called the Rise from Trauma Act. And in Section 101, it creates a grant program that creates funding for cross-sector trauma-informed community and statewide coalitions that allow for communities to really take that change and charge that we were talking about. But that's an example of how the federal government can promote resources that allow for communities to create their own sort of infrastructures and learning processes to address that root cause of trauma, as opposed to a strict top-down, one-size-fits-all approach. And then the whole second section, or most of the second section, I should say, of Rise from Trauma Act invests in trainings to work toward prevention and to create more of that shared language and understanding that is so core to a trauma-informed model. And through all of that, on the next slide, you'll see that we recognize that we need to work toward that more systemic approach. So frequently, our society has a treatment first approach. Treatment is often necessary, or sometimes necessary, I should say. And so we need to boost and bolster our workforce and systems to promote good treatment. But at the same time, when we have a treatment first approach, what we're seeing is that our systems are becoming overwhelmed by the demand on systems. And we could be doing so much more to prevent dysregulation, negative outcomes that require treatment. We can do more in the primary and secondary prevention layers to intervene successfully and just stop trauma and adversity and outsized stress from happening in the first place, which would reduce the burden that we have on our treatment model and allow for more individuals to get the support that they need. And I think that everybody in this work understands and has examples of how we have seen workforce burnout, people not being able to get the support they need when they really do need it. And so if we as a society can work more toward that prevention layer, which is why we need to invest more in that community capacity to bring the healing that's possible and promote resiliency at the community level, then we will be able to have more effective treatment models and methods that really help to create a more functioning and sustainable society in the long term. Because even tertiary prevention is prevention, that treatment layer is prevention for future generations as we block intergenerational transmission. And so if we view things through a prevention lens, there's so much power and possibility. And so that's why we drive systems change, put that onus on systems, as well as recognizing the individual strengths and capacities at the individual level. So with that, Whitney, I'll turn it back over to you to keep talking about, the policies and what makes legislation trauma-informed. But before that, if you have anything to add on those slides, please feel free.
You did a beautiful job, and you got your voice for the whole time. I love it. You preserved your voice. I love it. Great. I think you encapsulated all the main things. But yeah, I think, to Jesse's beautiful point about creating those systems, I do want to just take a moment to chat about what makes a policy quote unquote trauma informed, which is to say what we know about policies that might help us create those predictable patterns of behavior that Jesse has lifted up. And so on this slide, and continuing on to the next slide as well, which we'll take a look at in a second, you'll see a list of some of the factors that we at CTIP tend to look to in order to determine, okay, is this policy in existence or that is being proposed already aligned with our work? Or are there gaps that we need to consider filling by injecting these frameworks into the language of the legislation so folks can really get their needs met? So that is to say, again, we look at both the legislation that we can lift up and say, okay, Advocate Network, we are inviting you to activate around this great policy proposal like the Rise from Trauma Act that was just highlighted. As well as the policy that's related to, mental health or the legal system or the larger healthcare system, or other allied topics that don't explicitly incorporate the principles and ideas that you see on this slide. So we can then activate our network to instead say, okay, contact your legislators and let them know that you as constituents who have power want to see them, build more maybe protective factors for resilience into this bill, or that you want to see trauma-informed training explicitly integrated into this licensing requirement for this professional entity, whatever it might be. And so just to highlight a few policies that we like to either create language for or to lift up and tend to engage people with lived experience. So perhaps creating working groups or committees that can make decisions about services and supports that aren't just government administrators and bureaucrats and CEOs of healthcare organizations making decisions for larger communities, but also involving the community members who have had relevant experience navigating and interacting with those systems from the other side, for instance, just to lift up one example. And also things on this slide as well. And I'm not going to read them all to you. You certainly can read them, but just to lift up a couple key ones. Things like advocating for the creation of or supporting policies that establish statewide offices, for instance, to pay attention to and standardize best practices related to integrating trauma-informed, resilience building, and healing-centered approaches into all systems and supports and programs that the state has a role in. We also look to policies that fund public education and raise awareness in communities about trauma and equity and other allied and key concepts, or which enable, let's say, reimbursement, right, for trauma-specific services, or which integrate traditional healing approaches that are culturally responsive, making sure that if someone collects Medicaid, they're able to access supports that are culturally responsive and relevant to them. So lots of factors to consider here just at a glance. And I'll certainly send the PDF of the slides to our organizers today. So if you wanted to take a deep dive, you certainly can take a look at this. It's also, again, in our advocacy series that we'll talk to a little bit later. And I just want to say before moving on that it's, of course, really unlikely, right, that a single piece of legislation would fully actualize all of the principles of a trauma-informed approach. It's probably not going to happen anytime in the immediate future, maybe someday once this lexicon is more familiarized to people. And so even without that, though, we can look at these and other indicators to tell that a policy is aligned with our vision or has opportunities for us to advance this movement. And that can help our work in meaningful ways, right? It's not an all or nothing thing. This is a process, and we need to celebrate the progress that we make, even in small ways. And so these, again, are some of what we know can be useful for to look for, rather. And okay, so let's say you've got your networks together, you've got your policy priorities selected, and you're ready to actually begin taking folks, or rather talking to folks with influence about this. So let's take a look at using stories to make that happen. That's sort of the next step here. And so, we know that storytelling is sort of how we do learning as humans. And that's been true for just about as long as we've been a species, based upon what we know, right? And storytelling can help bring an issue to life and be more impactful in demonstrating the benefits of a policy measure or proposal than providing just dry facts and figures alone, although those certainly can be important to bolster our arguments and our stories. Stories really have the power to counter stereotypes and foster connection across divides. They lend this sense of emotional potency and they convey urgency. And since we're all here with the Strong Brain Institute, we thought we might bring a brain science lens to really emphasize how impactful storytelling can be in general when we're looking to make these types of changes, because we know that storytelling is connected to brain processes that we know influence behavior change, which is ultimately what we're looking at when we think of advocacy, right? Like that's the framework for this. We're looking for behavior change and philosophical change as well. And so to start, sort of technically, a well-told story can engage many, many areas of the brain, including significant activity in our cortical areas that are specialized for production and comprehension, respectively, of language. And lots of things can happen as a result of activating our brain to really connect with and pay attention to language, which tells us, right, as advocates, language that we use is really important. That's our tool to get behavior change. And so there's a more, I would say, visceral activation of our limbic system that happens as well. And that's really where our gut feelings, so to speak, come from. And that heavily relates to our behaviors and decision-making processes, right? We rely on our nervous systems for that instinctual guidance. And that ties into the emotional transportation piece. So we get sucked into compelling stories, right? Been on a Netflix binge for many hours, can confirm, have been in that place. And I think that's a very human thing, because brain scans show that at the story arcs, those tense moments where you're wondering whether the sort of hero's journey will be successful, our cortisol levels spike. We really feel this in our souls, and our brains are awakened by that. And so similarly, research has shown that we get hits of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that, among other things, makes us feel happy when there's a victory or satisfying resolution for the character we're really rooting for. And because we find points where we relate to characters in stories and we can really envision ourselves as those actors, that that shows up in our oxytocin, or the bonding hormone, or love hormone if you prefer, and that flows through us in hearing stories. So even if we don't have a whole lot in common with the characters on the surface, that oxytocin can bring us to feel connected and relate to, and empathize with characters. And that empathy, that's powerful in advocacy work. It is critical, because it can break down barriers like discrimination and bias. It can cross party lines. And stories ultimately, in that way, generate empathy because they ground us in our shared and common humanity. And so, speaking to that empathy and connection piece, neural coupling also activates part of the brain that allow the listener to turn the stories into their own ideas and experiences. So we know that we tend to place ourselves again in those character roles because we're making meaning of these stories, differently based on our own experiences and perspectives, right? So two people could hear the same story and have completely different takeaways to an extent. And that makes it really important for us as advocates, to know who is in front of us and really try to appeal to what their sense of what they'd like to see happen, their values, and consider that in what would make this story immersive and engaging for them. Really helping them understand why they ought to care, which we'll talk about in the framework we'll share shortly. And while knowing what to appeal to in terms of emotional or values-based common ground when it comes to your target audience is important, we also know that mirroring happens during storytelling. And that means really that listeners will not only experience similar brain activity to one another as they convene and share this common experience of storytelling, but also to the speaker when stories are told. There'll be that connection. So even after we leave the room, so to speak, we have the power to convey and catapult this conversation, catalyze change through these ongoing conversations that will happen long after we've made our elevator speech or our pitch, so to speak. And that keeps our advocacy issues front of mind for folks. And going back, right, there are a lot of competing issues to pay attention to. So that can be really critical. And what we focus on grows bigger, right? We know that that's true. So the more conversations are happening, the more likely change in alignment with our story's message is likely to occur. And finally, when these processes happen, our brain can more easily remember and retrieve information from our stories. So those things that we convey, rather than just facts and figures, the ways that we generate that feeling of impact and demonstrate the real scope of the issues and solutions that we're looking to propose. Where there's emotionally charged content, we're going to remember that as humans with greater accuracy when we're connected to the story. Just to put it simply, stories tend to make it easier for our brains to store data for later retrieval. And so there's really like a lot happening, right, inside of our brains when we hear stories. You might not have thought it was so complex, but it's pretty remarkable to think about. And that all connects with what you see on this slide, because we're activating the brain to connect with our story, to inspire action. And that means we have to overcome some of what chills the broad change we're hoping to see in the work, to grow our power as an advocate network. So on the left column, you see things that inhibit change, right? Or on the right column, rather, the things that inhibit change, right? So outside of the context of power dynamics, there's also this aspect of breaking through the inertia or unwillingness to take a bold stance and lead the charge toward change against the status quo, as well as that apathy and fear and isolation and self-doubt that we know can contribute to folks rationalizing inaction. And so on the other column on the left there, you see key elements that can make the storytelling framework we share so powerful. And that's because it's designed to overcome these common action inhibitors. And I imagine each of us really knows the tension of noticing the contradiction between where the world is right now and where we wish it was, or where we believe it ought to be, right? That is a common feeling I am sure we have all had. And through storytelling, we actually can use that emotional tension to create a context of empowerment toward action that hits on all the things that we talked about when it comes to the brain connecting with stories. And so on the left column, again, those action motivators that tell us that we can attend to in order, what we can attend to in order to not negate some of those common feelings that inhibit action are things like we can mobilize urgency and anger and hope and solidarity and self-efficacy in our stories. And that's what YCMAD, you can make a difference, means, basically self-efficacy, right? And that's all based on how we tell our stories. And that brings us to this framework that we're going to give you a pretty high level overview of. And I want to share this. It's a framework initially developed by Marshall Gans, a public policy expert and lecturer at Harvard University, who played an instrumental role in shaping Barack Obama's really successful grassroots organizing model by rooting it in this public narrative framework. And before diving in, I just want to mention that it's important to recognize that your story is your story, and that no one knows your story better than you. So this isn't about changing the key details of your story. It's about framing your authentic truth immersively to have the greatest advocacy impact for policy change. And so for the purposes of today, again, there's a very deep dive in our advocacy series, but just starting with it, by the way, again, story of self, us, and now. And so starting with the story of self at a high level, this involves the storyteller, i.e. you, the advocate, describing events, challenges, and choices that led them to act. You know, when did you first feel like you had to do something about this? And what are the reasons that you felt like you could do something? How did you get the courage and the hope to act at those choice points you encountered? And you can connect this with your target audience's values to enhance their motivation to join you in taking action. Next part is the story of us, and this captures the shared values, experiences, and capacities of folks that are joining together to work toward change. So the us here will change depending on your target audience, right? You want to include both your work as well as something that would feel like it relates to them. The goal of this part of the story is really to create that common humanity that I mentioned before, that sense of unity and togetherness, and focus on the shared values and common ground our listeners have with us, while uplifting moments of success and resilience that you've already witnessed along the way, right? We've seen these things work, and here's how. And finally, the story of now outlines the current challenge that your audience faces in a way that presents a vision for change and a potential outcome that is within reach if and only if your advocacy targets join in the effort, right? They are the hero in this story. And a part of this is highlighting the urgency of the situation, and demonstrating how the world out there is not as it ought to be based on our deeply held shared values. That means we're at a choice point, and summoning your audience to make a choice by responding, by taking concrete action to bring about change, comes with you framing the story in an effective way and making the act, so to speak, based on the urgency of the here and now. And so in sum, this framework taken together is basically, here's the challenge, here's how I'm involved, here's how our community members and your constituents are impacted, here's why it's relevant to you personally, and here's a solution for action that can make a meaningful impact that we can only accomplish with your help. And so ultimately, by weaving together the stories of self, us, and now, you can construct a compelling and inspirational narrative in which your target audience members, again, whoever they are, begin to see themselves as the hero characters of this story. This is their hero's journey. And that can move people to act and grow power for the accomplishment of your policy agenda, as we've talked about before. And so finally, we are wrapping up here, looking at the time, hoping to get some questions in. Just so you know, if you want to dig in any more to this particular storytelling model, there's a whole module on it in our advocacy series linked here for you. There are worksheets to help you individually and in groups move through this framework and think about how to use it in different contexts, elevator speech, cocktail party spiel for when you're just already in a conversation, or when you see someone who might be important to bring on board and you really want to advocate. There's a lot of guidance for that, and there are 9 total modules. There are several other topics for you as well to expand the knowledge base that we've started working on today. And we also have a resource center on our website that helps, that contains a great many type of tools and a lot of information that can help support your own advocacy efforts. If again, something jazzed you today and you're curious to learn more, there's a lot of different resources there for you as well. And so in terms of right now, I think we have a Q&A time, but Jesse, before I move on to that, I wonder if there's anything that you want to sort of cap us off with or add before we check in with folks.
Nah, I spoke longer than anticipated, so less time for Q&A. So want to make sure that, folks who have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Wally's putting a few links into the chat as well. So just want to highlight that there's an individual sign up link and an organization sign up link to join the Community Advocacy Network, to be a part of the campaign for trauma-informed policy and practice as we continue to promote this. And we asked for folks to sign up. That'll include calls. You'll get emails about calls to action, our CTIP CAN calls, our monthly calls, and other opportunities. And so just wanted to point that out. But if there are any questions, we've got a few minutes. Wally, I see you on screen, so I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I have one question which has been troubling us a lot, which is the messaging, because the people who come to this meeting are all in with words like trauma informed and resilience informed. But when you start reaching out beyond our safe zones, people don't like a lot of those words and they're tired of hearing about it. And so we've been struggling with our public messaging, with going between terms like trauma informed or resilience informed or ACEs informed or things like that. And you used the term trauma informed a lot throughout your session, and this isn't a fault of that. It's more like, have you been seeing some writing on the wall? Like, for example, PACE's connection focuses now on the positive instead of just the adverse stuff. And so I'm wondering if you've had any thought to moving language to a new place, which is not going to sort of prejudiciously put off people who are tired of hearing about all the trauma in the world.
Yeah, it's a great question, Wally, and it's real, right? I talk a lot about the echo chamber that we exist in, and when you get outside of that, and even within the folks that are interested in this movement, there is a belief that trauma informed is deficit based. I will say that I do think that it's important to recognize that trauma exists in our world in very real ways, and we need to address that, as well as recognize the resilience focused and prevention oriented sides, right? There's also asset and strength based sides. But I think that when we talk to people outside of the trauma informed movement, a lot of people don't know what trauma informed means. A lot of people within the trauma informed movement don't know what trauma informed means. There isn't really a standard definition. We have 6 principles that are largely agreed upon from SAMHSA. But I think that what we really talk about is a solutions oriented approach to address the root causes that drive so many different sort of challenges that our society is facing. And so when we have conversations with different people have different interests, but almost universally, people's interests can align with a trauma informed approach to be able to make headway in the long term to address what people care about, whether that be the substance use and overdose crisis that we're experiencing, youth mental health and suicide, poor graduation rates, high incarceration, high taxes. Even we can get into the cost avoidance and cost reductions that systems experience when we address trauma as the root cause. And so, I think that when I'm in presentation mode, we use the word trauma informed because we are the campaign for trauma informed policy and practice. But in those one-on-one conversations, when I am being the advocate and have that hat on, it's more of that solutions oriented approach of what are we really talking about and how can we drive sustainable change, instead of focusing so much on the jargony language that I think is what you're asking about. Whitney, I don't know if you have any thoughts as well.
I think you encapsulated it perfect, Jesse, right? Like really trying to emphasize what we actually want to see different, and painting that picture of a preferred future for them can be stronger than talking about the actual trauma aspect. And so, yes, bringing light to exactly what Jesse said. Trauma is real. We have to honor that, and a universal precaution toward that is the goal, right? That we understand that this is a part of the human experience, especially now. And also that framing of, and this is what actually we mean by what we want to see different. This is what the actual vision we have looks like. So I support that. I think you did great, Jesse.
Thanks, Whitney. And I know that we're at time, so I'll turn it back over to you. But one last piece that Wally, I'll put in the chat, to share with folks is a brilliant vision that Whitney put together. Oh, Ben, I'll send it to you. Which sort of looks at real real solutions that have been implemented in society across all levels that Whitney was talking about to really get to a solutions oriented approach.
Jesse and Whitney, thanks so much for joining us today. Everyone that's in attendance still, thanks so much for joining. I know there's going to be different definitions of some of the words we're talking about, but I've been involved in, I think, under this umbrella of the trauma-informed movement for about 6 or 7 years, and there was always a huge vacuum that I think CTIP is filling, specifically on trying to organize some of these movements and having a sharp, and I think of like an arrow, like the end of the arrow, the tip of the arrow, to start funneling resources down to some of the folks that are on the ground doing the work. So we really appreciate you. I personally appreciate you. And anything ASBI can do to help get out your message is, I look at that as directly under our mission and personal and organizational mission. So thanks again for spending some time with us. I will send out there'll be a small survey that's sent out to participants tomorrow. Jesse and Whitney, if there's anything else you want me to get out to them, events CTIP we're putting on in the near future, I'd be happy to put it in that survey result. And let's give the gift of time and thanks again for your time. And again, anything you want me to send out to panelists or to attendees, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.